The two letters we're looking at in this week's study of the letters of Paul are Philemon and Philippians. They're known as part of Paul's prison discourse. Now, one of the unauthenticated letters of Paul is also included in that, but these are the two authentic letters. From Paul's own description, he was put in jail numerous times as he preached the gospel, as he went around doing his thing. We've got no real detail except that that's where he encountered a lot of people, and he considered prison to be a major part of his ministry. So we're left with this image of someone who is constantly willing to push the boundaries and um, anger the authorities in order to get his word across. So let's first of all look at Philemon. Philemon is the shortest of the letters authentic letters that Paul wrote. And what's really unique about Philemon is it's addressed to a person, not a community, not a region. It's a person. And it's on a very particular manner, something that is known to Philemon and Paul and those in their community. But really, the reason for the letter has been lost in posterity. And one of the challenges that brings is that when you don't know the issue, you don't understand how to really evaluate the response. So, this letter to Philemon has been used for centuries to justify slavery, returning slaves that have run off, and also been used by by abolitionist movements to justify why slavery shouldn't happen. So, again, that's history putting its own spin on a letter that Paul wrote 2,000 years ago. And in order to better understand Paul's position, we actually have to look at 2,000 years ago. Now, those of us raised in North America, when we hear the word slavery, very quickly we look at what comes to mind is the African slave experience in the United States and to a lesser extent in Canada. The reason I say lesser is because it was abolished and there wasn't as much of it, but it existed in Canada as well. And the whole concept of owning people for life, stealing them from other countries, that an entire group of people was put in slavery simply for their ethnicity. That's not the slavery we're talking about in first century Palestine. And that's something that we have to kind of get our heads around. We are not dealing with some of the horrific things that happened, particularly in the American South. Now, it's not that slavery was good, slavery is never good, but the reason for it was a bit different. First of all, it was a major part of the economy. Every community, every country in ancient times practiced slavery. It was often a matter of having convicts after a war or skirmish of some kind. It was a power trip in that regard. There's also a lot of economic slavery, which meant the people who could not pay for their lives were sold into slavery or sold members of their family into slavery, often daughters, who often would end up in prostitution situations, as a way of getting the family as a whole out of their troubles. Now, remember, these are compound families; these are not nuclear families as we understand. So, one or two people sacrificed for the good of the whole was considered socially acceptable, no matter how hideous the experience might have been. And another element to slavery is that you could buy yourself out. You could become a free citizen. There was actually terms in the Roman world for people who had managed to work themselves out, or who had done their time, or who had managed to gain citizenship. So it wasn't a life only. It wasn't racially based. It wasn't gender based. There were generational slaves, so children born of women in slavery would tend to be slaves themselves. That often had to do with the fact that most of these children were the result of sexual encounters with the paterfamilias, or a dominant male in the household. And as we talked about in one of the previous letters, there was a social hierarchy that anybody, male or female, below your social status was free game sexually. That was just accepted as part of the culture. And that was one of the things that Paul talked against, and the early Christians talked against when they talked about the sexual purity laws. This was not about complete abstinence was what God required, but that the Christian community did not want to have people abused sexually and mistreated sexually. They wanted more equality in those type of relationships, more respect, more fidelity, more honesty in those kind of things. So we're dealing with part of the culture that is expansive. It's everywhere. Hebrews were slaves, they owned slaves. The early Christians were slaves, they owned slaves. The Gentiles were slaves and they owned slaves. There was no political distinction from any of this. So it's this cultural background that we're dealing with when we talk, when we read Paul's talk to Philemon about slavery and about how there's two types of slavery, essentially: a legal slavery, which we just recounted, but also the spiritual slavery that Paul talks about. And when Paul talks about slavery, spiritual slavery, he's actually coming at it from two different perspectives. First, slavery as in adherence to the Hebrew tradition and how God frees us of that. So a freedom of that level of slavery, that as we're followers of Jesus, we're no longer bound to be enslaved by the old laws. That's one part of Paul's message. But the other part, in many ways, is the exact opposite, where he talks about people now becoming slaves to Jesus. So no longer are they slaves to the Hebrew laws, but they're slaves to Jesus. And the freedom in that, and the freedom not to have to make decisions, not to wonder where your next meal is coming from, because part of the slavery covenant, essentially, was that, yeah, you may work without pay, but all your needs were provided. So it wasn't necessarily the most hideous way to live. And by being a slave through Christ, you had all those decisions made for you. All you had to do was obey and follow. So even though it sounds like Paul is contradictory, and I mean he is, it's just two different facets of how Paul explained that relationship with Christ to people around, using metaphors that people would understand. So he's not going outside of what is normal. And this is a really important part of being an apologist, is putting your message within the cultural context of your listeners. So in the letter of Philemon, he is writing to this person, Philemon, about this other person, Onesius, who had been serving Paul. Now, many people have interpreted Onesius as a slave of Philemon's, that he's encouraging Onesius to return and Philemon to accept. So that's where a lot of the runaway slave ideology comes from. But a really careful reading of Philemon suggests that Onesius wasn't a slave to begin with, that he potentially was a brother that was estranged from Philemon. Whatever the dynamic, it's lost in history. We don't know exactly what it was. We do know, however, that Paul put Philemon on in a very uncomfortable place, because this was a letter read publicly, not privately. So Philemon would have had this read out in worship. He would have been called out in public. And there was no other action on his part except to do what the letter required. So Paul really set him up. And in this letter, we have, again, no sense of what's what as to what the disagreement was, but a sense of needing to reconcile. And it's interesting that the language of slavery continues on, and the desire to reinterpret this letter between friends and potentially brothers in terms of representing Christianity as a whole and social stigma and strata as a whole. So one of the things that we always have to be careful of when we're reading ancient texts is putting too much assumption on it. And Philemon is a classic example of that. With so much placed on Philemon, we're unable to kind of separate what's going on. So this is an example of Paul as a politician. And we'll get that again in Philippians. The fact that Paul knows how to work the patronage system. He knows how to make people bend to his will. He's not a naive letter writer. He's not a naive Christian. He understands how people interact, which in my mind makes Paul a lot more interesting, because the Acts version of Paul, again, is almost superhero worship of him. Paul exposes who he is a lot more clearly than if we just look at the history that Acts places on him. Who he is as a person is some bit of a wheeler dealer. He knows how to get to things. Probably one of the reasons he ended up in prison so often. And he sees this as a positive part of his ministry. And that whole old saying that there's no bad publicity. Well, Paul continues to say in Philippians, being in prison, not a bad thing as far as getting attention. Also, if you've got people speaking about Christ and positive people speaking about Christ, at least Christ is still being talked about. So he really sees the ability to spread Christianity in any place that he's at. He will use any social situation he is, which of course brings us to Philippians. Now, Philippians is rather interesting in and of itself. Yes, it's a prison letter, and Paul goes through the usual patronage back and forth, and that means that his letters all begin and end in a certain way. He comments who has given him benefit. Towards the end of Philippians, we see that he is acknowledging the money that they sent him to take care of himself and to do what he needs to do. When he does the proper homage of you sent me so much, I didn't really need it, but I appreciate it, and this is how I'm using, and I'll name this person and this person and this person. So there's that whole sense of this is my group of people who I give authority to, that you're supposed to listen to, all the while warning that there's another voice out there that is not quite so accurate. And one of the ways he identifies that is the use of the term dogs. Now we're going backwards in Philippians rather, as we do this. Now, the term dogs is been used in a very anti-Semitic way. And that's, again, something we have to acknowledge and keep in tension while we're doing Paul, because Paul is a Hebrew person. He is a Semitic person all the way through. He's not writing to be anti-Paul. As we saw with the letter of Philemon, Paul is very political. He is very aware of how to get what he wants and use people around him for that purposes. So he's not going to say anything that dismisses himself. He might humble himself. He might do the mea culpa, and he might take advantage of all sorts of literary devices to suggest he is less worthy than in someone else. But really at the heart of it, Paul does not see himself that way. Paul sees himself as a bit of a wheeler dealer, quite frankly, a bit of a power source, that he has the truth on his side. So when we read him talking about dogs, he's not actually talking trash essentially against the Hebrew culture. What he is doing, however, is expressing frustration. And we've seen in other letters of Paul, especially 2 Corinthians, Paul has a temper. And Paul lets go when he's really angry with something. He's really angry. Every letter that he brings us up, he's really angry about those who are still trying to tell the Gentiles that they have to go through circumcision first. And one of the reasons he argues that is his conviction of faith alone. That's all we need to be part of the community of Christ. We do not need to go through actions. It doesn't have to be a series of rituals. If you notice, Paul doesn't pay a whole lot of attention to baptism. He recognizes he's baptized some few people, but he doesn't make a big deal of it. He sees circumcision as a detraction, not a step away, but as a detraction from your faith. You do not have to go through the laws of the Hebrew people, the expectation of membership, in order to become Christian. Paul is very, very clear about that. So please do not read this as anti-Semitic, but it is annoyed. It is quite angry because Paul is kind of fed up with people coming in from Jerusalem and other places telling these new Christians, if they want to be genuine followers of Christ, you have to go through the Hebrew tradition first. And Paul's mission is quite different. Now, the reason we're doing Philippians backwards and doing those two issues first is because the front part of Philippians is actually quite different and historically significant. In it, we have the first reference to the church structure and the very first hymn that was probably shared and sung in the early Christian communities. And if you look at them really, really closely, it gives an image of what was going on in the first few decades after Christ. By the time we hit um, the century mark, where the Gospels have been written and they become the standard for how to understand Jesus and how to work out theology, a lot of Paul's letters are pushed to the side. But from a historical perspective, he's the one that gives us insight into the earliest community. So first off, Paul acknowledges, the name drops again, and then he acknowledges the bishops and deacons. Now that's really exciting when you're a historian, because the how the church was structured originally is very different from how it's structured today. A lot of our structure today actually comes from the church moving into Constantinian Rome. It's not from the earliest Hebrew and Gentile followers. The earliest ones had a system of a bishop and deacon. So a deacon was your practical person. The deacon was the one that managed the money, managed the baptisms, managed the Eucharist, did all the stuff that needed the community to keep going, made sure the widows and orphans were taken care of, made sure the sick were attended to, organized who was going to be on this committee, and do whatever needed to happen. Very much a comparable position to the archsynagogus in the Hebrew community. So that structure, that outline, was already familiar to the Hebrews and to the God-fearers, the Gentiles who had already been following the Hebrew tradition. And, it wasn't broke, so they kept using it. The bishops themselves were actually the teaching elders. So they would probably be the ones that read out the letters. They were probably a little more educated, a little more wealthy, so they had had the leisure to study more. Now, none of these people were uneducated. They might not have been formally schooled the way we assume education looks, but they all would have had considerable education in their faith and perhaps other philosophies that surrounded them. So they were educated, but perhaps not able to write down what they thought, because in this day and age, reading and writing were taught as two separate skills. So the bishop probably had that skill of writing, or at least enough to make it out. And there's an assumption when we look at historical stuff that only the elites had education, only the elites had scribes to copy out their stuff. Well, we see that Paul was not an elite, but he had a scribe. So that knowledge was in the community, and it was passed down in families, and it was passed down in communities for a variety of purposes. Law clerks, businesses, all of these documents that were written had to have scribes. So the bishop, the teaching elder, the most learned of the community, when Paul or someone else would arrive, they would basically defer to Paul or another celebrated leader. When Paul and others were not there, the bishop would take the role as the educator, the formation guidance person, the one who would make sure everybody knew what was what. Who was missing in the early church structure? Priests. The reason priests were missing is because that was something that happened in the temples. The Gentile temples, the Hebrew temples had priests. Synagogues, small communities, home churches, they didn't have priests, because a priest was someone who was ritually assigned to take care of certain aspects. And the early church didn't have that need. They didn't have that people. It's not until a century or two happens that we start to see priests being entered into the dynamic. And priests came from the bishop class, essentially. So they took over the role of central leader, took on some of the ceremonial stuff that the deacons had to do, and the bishop themselves were elevated to looking after a region. So in the early days, the bishop was not the political leader of the group, or the CEO, essentially. That came in the first couple of centuries, however, when we started to have all of these house churches, and the bishop would be elevated. Now, above the bishop would eventually be the pope. So the pope would be the most bishoply bishop going on, and all major communities had their pope. And a side note, the reason the pope in Rome had ascendancy is not because Rome was an important community. It was actually considered a backwater. The reason Rome had ascendancy was because the Greeks and those in northern Africa and up through Jerusalem were always arguing about points of theology. So they would bring in the Romans to settle the deal. That's the only reason the Roman church got priority. And the Romans took it personally, thought they were better than that. And of course, we get a couple thousand years of history of arguments between who has authority and who doesn't, between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. But originally, Rome was not known for being particularly reflective or theological. We don't see someone from Rome actually contributing much to the theological conversation until you get into the 3rd and 4th century. So in the earliest days when Paul is writing, and when, in fact, when the Gospels are being written and the first couple of centuries are happening, Rome isn't really that significant. The best thinkers were Greek out of their own political and philosophical education, and the actions of how the Christian community developed were actually more out of North Africa and swinging up into Syria than anything else. So we get a structure picture of the very, very first generations that talks about bishops and deacons. Now, one of the other things about this is that the bishops and deacons were jobs, they were not titles. So there was a whole lot of people over the time who had these positions. And you could be a bishop and then become a deacon and then a regular congregant, move back up to a bishop. So there's a lot of fluidity there. As the jobs needed to be filled, they were filled. Now, one of the challenges when you're looking at the history of women in these positions is that tradition holds that women did not have these titles. Well, tradition is accurate insofar as a lot of these titles were not necessarily assigned to those who did the job. One of the ironies of those who want to dismiss women having these jobs is there's not a whole lot of proof that men had these jobs either. We just have a historical bias that men filled them in, but we don't have actual evidence that men did any of these things. We have the evidence of a few men claiming these roles as titles and writing about it. That's the first we get. The earliest church, however, it wasn't a title, it was a job description, kind of like the chair of the finance committee. That's not a title, it's a job. So we get the very first job or jobs in the Christian community as it organizes. And then we move into the very first hymn that we have in recording, and that's in chapter 2 of Philippians, starting around the 6th verse, I believe. And if you look at the words closely, they still have not figured out Christology, Trinitarian theology. There's no reference to the Holy Spirit in this, and there's also no reference to the virgin birth. These are traditions that will come out of the Christian world. And by the time Matthew and Luke are writing, around 80 and 90 CE, the tradition of the virgin birth is more common and then shared. But in the first generations with Paul, it's not even a thing. At least not a thing that Paul wants to recognize, or that the early Christians recognized in their hymnody. They also didn't know what to do with Trinity. So we don't have any discussion about incarnation. We have God pouring God's self into Jesus, but we don't have it as a sense of God birthed as Jesus. So this is a shift that will happen over the next couple of hundred years as Christians work out why we are a monotheistic tradition, but we've got three focuses with our one God. And traditional Trinitarian theology will not really be worked out until around 190 and onward. So very, very far away from Paul and his thoughts. So these are a couple of really, really interesting snapshots and windows onto the early church, how it was structured, how it saw itself, and what it believed. And that's one of the really cool things about studying Paul, is that we get these options. Now, next week, we're going to be looking at the book of Romans. Now, the reason Romans is so significant, well, first of all, it's first because it's the biggest. As we've mentioned, the letters of Paul are placed in order of size. But the second thing that makes Romans really significant is that Rome is not a community that Paul started. All the rest that we've looked at have been started by Paul. He maintains them. He identifies himself as the Father, as well as brothers and saints who are equal in all participation. With the letter to the Romans, however, Paul has to justify himself, why they should welcome him, why they should fund his mission trip to Spain, and why he even matters for them to take attention to. So we're going to be looking at that a lot more full. Thank you.